I know people that when they come off heroin, they become alcoholics.
December 25th, 1985. Phil Lynott collapses at home, the home of his daughters. His mother is right by his side. The man before them is no longer the powerhouse the world used to watch on stage. Not the Thin Lizzy frontman who seemed too strong, too charismatic, too damn alive to go out like this. In a matter of days, he'll be dead. But the real story isn't the death itself. By this Christmas morning, his life had been off the rails for a long time. The addiction had been dragging on for months. His marriage was crumbling. The band was history, yet the myth of the bulletproof rock star was still holding on. And that's exactly what makes Phil Lynott's story so hard to stomach. He didn't just crash overnight. He took a long, slow fall right in plain sight. Phil Lynott hit the crowd hard, mainly because he looked like the absolute last guy who would end up like that. On stage, he wasn't just a singer. He wasn't just a bass player. He was a force. You bought into him the second you saw him. Tall, cocky, a black Irishman in a scene where just showing his face broke the mold. But he didn't hide from being an outsider. He weaponized it. He made it his edge. That was the Lynott effect. He looked tough, streetwise, genuinely dangerous. But underneath that leather, he was writing sharp, deeply poetic lyrics. He was never some hollow, macho frontman. He packed the swagger and the control, but underneath it all, there was vulnerability, a raw, exposed nerve. That's why he hooked you deeper than the rest. Then came 1976. Thin Lizzy blew the doors off the place. Phil wasn't just a standout musician anymore. He became a global icon, a guy who seemed purpose-built for the spotlight. And that's exactly why his downfall hit so damn hard. When a giant like that crumbles, it's not just another rock and roll casualty. It's the shattering of a myth. This story didn't start fracturing in 1985, or even in 1983, when Thin Lizzy called it quits. The first crack showed up way earlier than that. Growing up, Phil was almost always the odd man out in any room he walked into. He got used to feeling like an outsider real early on. And those kinds of things don't just fade away, they just shapeshift. It looks like music became the place where he could rewrite his own script. Up on that stage, he wasn't the kid waiting for acceptance anymore. There, he could be bigger, louder, stronger. The kind of guy you couldn't just brush aside. That was the real engine driving his persona. That's why you can't write off his hard man image as just some cheap pose or a slick rock and roll gimmick. It was protection. The leather, the swagger, the absolute confidence, the heavy-hitting delivery, it all worked like a suit of armor. And the armor did its job. It gave him the stage, the status, and the power to hold a crowd in the palm of his hand. But at the same time, it built a trap. The problem is, when a man lives inside a persona for that long, he starts to depend on it. It gets harder to show any weakness, harder to admit he's losing his grip, harder to ask for a damn lifeline. And this is exactly where Phil's story cuts the deepest. The very same armor that made him invincible is what ultimately kept him from saving his own life. If you see this as more than just another cliché story about talent and drugs, if you see a man who hid behind his own myth for way too long, sound off in the comments. We want to know what hits you the hardest. The permanent tough guy mask? The broken family? The collapse of Thin Lizzy? Or watching a man of this magnitude pretend he had it all under control for years? We're moving forward. Because the heaviest part of this story isn't the crash itself. The hardest part is how damn long everyone refused to call it a fall. Thin Lizzy didn't become legends overnight. But by the mid-70s, they had what most bands would kill for: a signature sound, raw energy, and a frontman you couldn't mistake for anyone else. Twin lead guitars, a heavy live sound, street-level attitude, and lyrics where Phil seamlessly fused muscle with vulnerability. Then came Jailbreak. And with it, the boys are back in town. That's when the whole thing exploded. Thin Lizzy wasn't just a heavyweight British-Irish act anymore. They were a global powerhouse. For Phil, this was the summit, the peak he had spent his whole life building himself for. Now, he had everything to prove he had finally won. The fame, the money, the massive arenas, the respect, the house, the wife, the kids. He no longer looked like a guy with something to prove. Hell, From the outside, it looked like he'd already proven it all. He became exactly who he wanted the world to see, a man holding the crowd, holding his life, and holding his entire world firmly in his grip. And right here is the biggest lie of the whole story. Because it was exactly at this peak that the destruction became almost invisible. On the surface, it looked like Phil had finally beaten every single demon that ever tried to break him. But in reality, the crack just went underground. It ran deeper. And because of that, for a long damn time, nobody wanted to see it. Heroin didn't smash into his life like some overnight disaster. At first, it almost looked like a practical fix. The road chewed people up. Fame demanded non-stop fuel. The rock scene of that era had already turned hard drugs into standard operating procedure, not a red flag. In a climate like that, addiction easily disguised itself as just another lifestyle. For Phil, this was especially dangerous because in the beginning, the roof didn't cave in. He still hit the stage, still wrote the tracks, still commanded the crowd. He was still the charming, vibrant Phil everyone knew. That's why so many people around him didn't see the wreck coming. The erratic behavior? Easy to chalk up to burnout, the pressure cooker of fame, his temper, or just typical rock star tantrums. As long as a guy is still clocking in and looks like himself on the surface, people find it way too damn easy to pretend everything is fine. But the problem ran deeper. For Phil, it seemed heroin wasn't just about the high. It was a way to kill the noise in his head. It gave him a pause, a feeling that the relentless pressure was finally backing off. A fleeting illusion of control. And this is exactly where addiction sinks its teeth into a guy like Phil Lynott, because that hard man mask didn't let him just throw his hands up and say, "I can't handle this." He had to play the strong man for far too long. And when a man is obligated to be bulletproof 24/7, he usually doesn't reach for a lifeline. He reaches for whatever temporarily kills the pain. The nightmare really started when Phil began losing his home, not just his career. On the surface, he could still play the role. Rock star, father, husband, man with a legacy big enough to fill a room. But behind closed doors, the balance had already shifted. Everything that mattered was bending toward one thing: the addiction. The marriage was barely holding. This wasn't a rough patch. It wasn't routine rock and roll chaos. Caroline could see the man beside her was no longer the old Phil. Not the one who had been warm, present, and alive in the room. Now she was looking at someone whose moods, choices, and daily rhythm were being run by the dope. That was the moment his family stopped being a refuge. It became another place the addiction had taken. That's why Caroline packing up the kids and leaving is not some tabloid detail or standard celebrity divorce. It's one of the hardest breaks in this story. In that moment, Phil lost his last real connection to ordinary life. The house that might have held him to the ground stopped doing that. And almost at the same time, Thin Lizzy started coming apart too. The atmosphere inside the band was turning toxic. People were burned out. Men were walking away. The pressure kept building. His career wasn't holding him together anymore. By 1983, both pillars were gone at once, his family and his band. And for Phil, that was terrifying. Thin Lizzy was never just a paycheck. It was the structure of his identity. Once the house was empty and the band was gone, there was almost nothing left to hold. After Thin Lizzy folded, nothing came back together. From the outside, it looked like a rough patch. He still had the name, the voice, the stage presence. He formed Grand Slam to prove he wasn't finished. There were still flashes. He didn't vanish overnight, but the industry shifted. The same people who once saw certainty now saw risk. Doors opened slower. Calls thinned out, opportunities narrowed. Phil held on to the image, the jacket, the swagger, the stage version of himself. Sometimes it still worked. The crowd could still see it for a moment. But the people around him saw something else. Not a comeback, a steady fade, not a dip, but a loss of ground. There was no single crash. He kept moving, kept playing the role. The image lasted a little longer. The person behind it didn't. December 25th, 1985, Phil Lynott collapses at home. This isn't sudden. He had been going down for a long time. The Thin Lizzy legacy and his image kept it covered. By then, there was nowhere left to hide. He's taken to the ER. Doctors try to stabilize him for days. The damage holds. On January 4th, 1986, Phil Lynott dies. He is 36. The reaction follows: shock, grief, tributes. The legend is honored. But the long collapse behind it stays out of focus. This isn't just another line about a musician lost to drugs. That version is too simple. The reality is harder. He kept the image going while everything underneath was failing. By the time it broke, there was little left. What remains is the music, the statue in Dublin, the image people hold on to. Bronze shows the peak. It doesn't show the cost.